Everybody, I'm Jack the Rambling Raconteur, and I hope you're doing well. I hope you're having a nice end to this week. If you're in the U.S., I hope you had a happy Thanksgiving. If you were celebrating, we did. I roasted a turkey for the first time, and everybody survived what we ate, and we're all still happy, so we're doing well. This week, I finished reading 2666 by Roberto Bolaño. It's a monster of a book, and it's also a monstrous book. It's 893 pages, but it is a big, heavy, dense book that sets out to accomplish a lot of things. And in my reading experience, it accomplished one thing that I've never found a text to accomplish before. It was a very harrowing read. I'd been reading it since late September, so it took me almost exactly 2 months to read, in part because the fourth part was so dense and harrowing and sort of just dark, as a 300-page section, that I was reading it 10 pages a day in October. Sometimes I would take 2 days off and then read, about 20 pages. But it was a rewarding read, but a very intense reading experience. So I want to kind of gloss over what's going on, because there's 5 separate parts in the book that comprise the full novel, and then give a couple of readings, kind of give a taste of what you would expect if you were going to embark on a 900-page journey with Roberto Bolaño and these characters, and then just kind of draw just a couple of quick comparisons to some books that I think it reminded me of. And so, it starts out with, there's 5 parts. The part about the critics, the part about Amalfitano, who's just a character who's introduced in part 1, the part about fate, what is it? Yeah, the part about Fate, who's another character, and then the part about the crimes, and the part about Archimboldi. And so Archimboldi, who's that final part, he is this character who hovers over the first and 5th parts of the books, not so much the middle 3. The part about the crimes hover, they're introduced in part 1, and they actually hover very densely over parts 2 and 3 and 4, and then ultimately part 5. And part 5 acts as a counterpoint to part 4, while also looping back to part 1. So the critics, there's 4 critics. 3 of them are men from France, Spain, and Italy. They're all very different, unique characters. The 4th is a slightly younger English woman, and they're all obsessed with the same German writer. Notice that none of them are German. The same German writer, Benno von Archimboldi. He's very mysterious. They think he should have a Nobel Prize. He doesn't do readings. He doesn't come to these conferences. They have conferences where they're all
talking about him and all these deep interpretations on his work. And this is going on in the latter half of the 20th century. Within living memory, or memory of older readers. Part 2 then, it ends with them going to Santa Teresa, which is in northern Mexico. It's a fictional city. It's a stalking horse for Ciudad Juarez, which is in northeastern Mexico, right across the Rio Grande from El Paso, Texas. And Bolaño basically takes aspects of that city, specifically some of the crimes that have occurred there, and shifts it to a fictional city that is due south of where I live in Arizona. So it's about 2 hours south of Tucson, Arizona, right across the border in Sonora, Mexico. And so they end up there. They're kind of looking for Archimboldi. They've heard this mysterious, almost like Salandra-esque character lives there, except much more prolific. And they're introduced to a professor and dean at the university there, who is then the center of part 2. They don't meet Archimboldi. That's not a spoiler. Amalfitano then is part 2, and he is he works at this university. We learn a little bit about his life. He there's an association with Barcelona in Spain, but he's of course living in Mexico, and he has a teenage daughter. And the importance of the perspective is that, remember part 4, part about the crimes, he's worried about his daughter because the crimes are specifically murders and assaults on women. Sometimes the women are missing, and so he's worried about his daughter. Part 3, the book about Fate. Fate is a character, not the concept of fate. Fate is this character who is by far sort of the most left field interjection, on the narrative, because he's a young black reporter who works for a small black periodical in New York, I believe in Harlem. And so he is doing some interview in Detroit, and the paper's sports writer has had a stroke, so he has to be sent. He's the person who's closest to fly to Tucson, Arizona. to go cover this boxing match in Santa Teresa. He ends up there. Again, there is this sense of sort of dread, of fear around the crimes, even though we haven't had the specificity that's coming in part 4. He ends up meeting Amalfitano's daughter. So there are connections that exist. Part 4 then is the part that is just absolutely brutal. It's one of the hardest sections of literature I've ever encountered, I've ever read. But what it accomplishes is a deep, deep, deep focus on the victims of the crimes, not on the criminals, not on the investigators, but on the victims of the crimes. And so what makes it so hard is that all of these different women who are murdered and assaulted or go missing, it's almost like a medical examiner's report of what happened. And then it will say, okay, here's the detective who was assigned to the case, and after 5 days there were no clues, they added it, towards this log of like cases that are happening, because this is going on across years in the 1990s. Periodically it'll say, okay, they interviewed this ex-boyfriend or this husband or a colleague from work, and it turned out that that was who it was, that person confessed or that person fled. And so there's some closure on some of these crimes, but many of them it's unsolved. A character is introduced who may have committed some and is imprisoned, but the killings continue. And it's just absolutely brutal to read. I don't want to read from that at all because of just what the reading experience is like. But I want you to be aware, if you're going to read it, that's what's going on in that 4th part. And it's really the middle third of the book. The first 3 parts take up about 1/3 of the book. Part 4 is the middle third, and then part 5 is the final third. And so part 5 serves up this really interesting counterpoint. If part 4 was focused on all of these crimes occurring specifically, and it's detailing like individual crimes against these women, these murders across the 1990s, part 5 swings us back to 1920 in Prussia, so East Germany, where a boy is born. And it becomes clear that this is, the part about Archimboldi, that Archimboldi is this boy, and we're going to follow him like through his lifetime. And it's he's an odd, strange, interesting character, and he runs into some really interesting characters in like the 1930s in sort of this like more eastern part of Germany, as Nazi Germany is beginning to be created. And we know that the Holocaust is coming. He serves, this character Hans serves as a soldier on the Eastern Front in the German army. He does like there is a pericope sort of section where a character basically confesses to being part of the Holocaust of murdering Jews, and that character is found, dead, murdered in the camp after the war. And it becomes clear that Hans, the future Archimboldi, is the one who did that. And so he's, the Holocaust is almost serving as this complement to the violence that was so focused on in part 4. And so the final 600 pages are very, very dark. But we see Archimboldi in some really, the character in some really interesting then places after the war. So as he becomes a writer, some of the people he meets, and so relationships or names that occurred 700 pages ago are elliptically brought back, to fruition. We finally find a connection to some very important characters from book 4 around the crimes at the very, very end, in the final like 20 pages of the book. And so there's not a huge amount of closure in terms of all of those crimes from part 4, but then again, that's not the point of the book. So I wanted to give a couple of readings to share, what you get if you embark on this journey. The Bremen German Literature Conference was highly eventful. Pelletier, backed by Morini and Espinosa, went on the attack like Napoleon at Jena, assaulting the unsuspecting German Archimboldi scholars, and the downed flags of Pohl, Schwartz, and Borkmeyer were soon routed to the cafes and taverns of Bremen. The young German professors participating in the event were bewildered at first, and then took the side of Pelletier and his friends, albeit cautiously. The audience, consisting mostly of university students who had traveled from Göttingen by train or in vans, was also won over by Pelletier's fiery and uncompromising interpretations, throwing caution to the winds and enthusiastically yielding to the festive Dionysian vision of ultimate carnival, or penultimate carnival, exegesis, upheld by Pelletier and Espinosa. 2 days later, Schwartz and his minions counterattacked. They compared Archimboldi to Heinrich Boll. They spoke of suffering. They compared Archimboldi to Günter Grass. They spoke of civic duty. Borchmeyer even compared Archimboldi to Friedrich Dürrenmatt and spoke of humor, which seemed to Marini the height of gall. Then Liz Norton appeared, heaven sent, and demolished the counterattack like a Desai, like a Lanz, a blonde Amazon who spoke excellent German, if anything too rapidly, and who expounded on Grimmelshausen and Griffius and many others, including Theophrastus Bombastus van Hohenheim, better known as Paracelsus. If you were reminded at all of Umberto Eco's Foucault's Pendulum from that paragraph, that was the connection I made. So the first 150 pages of this book feel deeply informed by Foucault's Pendulum. Just this this tongue-in-cheek wink at literary criticism, at all these ideas around the great minds of Western civilization, and specifically the connections between philosophy and literature and history. And so it can be very, very funny. The relationships are well drawn in there, even if the men come off as creeps sometimes. The relationships are well drawn, and there is they're built up as creeps in order to reveal some humanity when they experience Santa Teresa and see the fear that some people live in there. So then in part 3, so this is with Fate, this is what you got. The funny thing is, the archetypes of human madness and cruelty weren't invented by the men of our day, but by our forebears. The Greeks, you might say, invented evil. The Greeks saw the evil inside us all, but testimonies or proofs of this evil no longer move us. They strike us as futile, senseless. You could say the same about madness. It was the Greeks who showed us the range of possibilities, and yet that now they mean nothing to us. Everything changes, you say. Of course everything changes, but not the archetypes of crime, not any more than human nature changes. Maybe it's because polite society was so small back then. I'm talking about the 19th century, 18th century, 17th century. No doubt about it, society was small. Most human beings existed on the outer fringes of society. In the 17th century, for example, at least 20% of the merchandise on every slave ship died. By that, I mean the dark-skinned people who were being transported for sale to Virginia, say. And that didn't get anyone upset or make headlines in the Virginia papers or make anyone go out and call for the ship captain to be hanged. But if a plantation owner went crazy and killed his neighbor and then went galloping back home, dismounted, and promptly killed his wife, 2 deaths in total, Virginia society spent the next 6 months in fear, and the legend of the murderer on horseback might linger for generations. And so again, we're now being introduced, this is in book 3 with Fate, but we're being introduced to this idea of when you have a mass totality of violence, of crime, of death, of suffering, it becomes so abstract. And people don't even think about it or consider it. But when there's this specific moment, and this specific, violence, this specific crime, people fixate on it and gravitate towards it and put a name to it and a face to it and those types of things. And so the mass has been dehumanized. And that, I think, is what book 4 really, or part 4 tries to do. Is part 4 tries to put a face, put a name, put a past, put a future that is taken away from the young women in part 4, and the families that are shattered. And that's what it accomplishes in a way that I've never experienced in literature, where it is a crime novel, essentially, that is so focused on the victims, not on the detectives, not on the criminals, not even necessarily on the society that allows all of this to happen, but truly on each of these individual victims. And it was such an unsettling experience. Like I said, I won't read from part 4 just because it's so dark. But in part 5, it's like this. This is Hans, who's meeting a character who will be important. First, he'd watched him in the library as ran his feather duster over the books. He had watched from the top of the rolling ladder as the Baron's nephew slept, breathing deeply or snoring, talking to himself, though not in whole sentences, but in monosyllables, scraps of words, particles of insults, defensive, as if in his sleep he were about to be killed. He had also seen the titles of the books the Baron's nephew read. Most were history books, which meant the Baron's nephew loved history or found it interesting, which at first struck the young writer as repulsive. Nights spent drinking cognac and smoking and reading history books? Repulsive. Which led him to wonder, all that silence for this? And he'd heard the words uttered by the Baron's nephew when he was woken by the least sound, the rustle of a mouse or the scrape of a leather-bound book as it was returned to its place between two other books. Words of total confusion, as if the world had shifted on an axis. Not the words of a man in love, but words of total confusion. The words of a sufferer. Words issuing from a trap. And so the humor remains, some of the sly aspects remain. Hans has this fascination early on of like diving and being fascinated with seaweed, which is why I wore the jellyfish shirt. And in fact, the inside of the cover has like, you know, pictures of seaweed. But there is, you know, from the readings, I think from all three of them, one of the things you could note is the first and third one at least, it's in this deep third person. So across the entire book, we have this third person narrative that feels somewhat detached, to be perfectly honest, except for in part 4, where the detachment becomes so aware that it's almost like you're aware that the writer's detached, as he has been throughout the book, that it starts to question, are you detached from all of these crimes, all of this suffering? And so it served as an interesting counterpoint. So I mentioned Foucault's Pendulum as a book that it reminded me of. In terms of the crimes, I think books that it seemed to have influenced, I would say the writings of James Ellroy influenced part 4. Some of the telegraph style, some of the like short encapsulated, very focused, and it's like here and then here and then, you know, and it's happening. David Peace's 1977 probably comes second closest, maybe 1983, second closest to capturing that sense of, you know, how important the identity of these victims are, how important their lives are, not just the criminals or the detectives in terms of a crime novel. And then two other books that sort of have that same influence. One is J.R. by William Gaddis, which I've seen people are reading, and I'm like, yeah, it's a great book. The way that characters just float in and out of J.R. or of William Gaddis' other book, The Recognitions, occurs in all throughout 2666. Characters just drive in, they drive out, they're introduced, they disappear for 300 pages, they pop back up, and it's the same character. It's not just like different, you know, it's the same name, but just like, oh, here for this scene, the way we see in like serial TV shows periodically. But it really is this same identity popping up, doing something interesting, and then disappearing. And it's done really well. I think that's hard to do, especially across a long book, and it's done really well in those. And then Song of Solomon, which I think is better than the books I've mentioned, but Song of Solomon by Toni Morrison accomplishes that same piece, where we have characters, and then another character is just introduced, we're going to get 3 pages about that person's past, and 4 pages around what that person's doing in the present, and then we're back to sort of our main line narrative. And so it, again, 2666, it was certainly worth my reading experience. I don't know if any other people have read it, if they have different interpretations of it. Maybe people hated it. I was ready to hate it, but it, you know, it was worth reading. So let me know what you think. I hope you have a great weekend. Bye.